Today we are talking about should you commit ego death, self-destruction, and transcendence. There are a lot of systems out there that tell you that you should destroy your ego or that you must destroy your ego in order to reach a higher state of consciousness or enlightenment. We're going to see that this teaching is actually very wrong. There's something that needs to be said here, and people can make a huge mistake when it comes to this. Now, there is a kind of self-destruction that is required, but not in the sense of permanently destroying one's ego. Now, this is going to be something that's important. We're going to kind of unpack it as we go along and explore it bit by bit. The first thing that we have to understand is, what is the ego? What is the ego? Because a lot of people, you hear the buzzword about destroying your ego a lot. But what is the ego? So you have these different structures in your mind. And what the ego is, it's the center of your field of consciousness. Now, I mean, if we want to get really detailed about it, we can call the ego a complex whose archetypal core is the higher self, etc. But in a nutshell, what it is, it's sort of this aggregate of everything that is you, or that you believe that is you. So things like your beliefs, your personality, your likes, dislikes, all these things come together and form your ego. Now, it's important to understand that you aren't your ego, but these are the things that form your ego. Now, for example, you also have your shadow self. Now, your shadow self are the parts that are still you, but that you have repressed and have disassociated from your ego, that you have removed sort of from your ego and repressed into your shadow self. They were once part of your ego, but you removed it and repressed them into your shadow self. This can be things like anger issues, or sexual urges, or a lot of different things that society deems as unacceptable. So you repress it into your unconscious mind. So that's still part of you, but your ego is who you are, or what, not who you are, but what makes up how your beliefs, dislikes, things of that nature. It isn't you, but it is an aggregate and a tool that is used by your higher self to be able to interact in the world. The true you. It's your vehicle for interaction and self-awareness. And there are many different tools that one uses. Now, for example, there's the persona. The persona is another tool that you use. The persona is just like the ego is sort of the way yourself interacts with the world. The persona is the way your ego interacts with society. You have a different persona for every societal situation, whether it's with your friends or family or coworkers. You act a different way, most likely, depending on what social group you're with. You'll act a different way from your coworkers, because if you act the way you do with your friends, you might get fired. And you might act the way with your family different from you act with your friends, because maybe your family doesn't approve of some of the stuff that you do. So you see that the persona is a version of you that is used to navigate social situations. The ego is sort of what your higher self, your true self, uses to navigate just existence in general, as far as when it comes to the physical world, interacting in the holos. Now, it's important to understand that the ego is your the center of your field of consciousness. If you did not have an ego, your ego develops when it's your sense of self. So it develops when you achieve self-awareness. When a human being achieves self-awareness, they develop an ego. The ego is your sense of I. It's the center of your field of consciousness. So if you didn't have an ego, you would not be self-aware. You would be in a animalistic, instinctual state. So it's important to understand that very important thing as we go forward. We're going to go along and take a look at this in more detail, but it's important to understand that your ego is your sense of self, your sense of I. It's not you. You're everything. You're your ego, your shadow self, and in Hyperionism we talk about your mirror self and your power self, your persona. You're everything. You're all of it. Your ego is just the center of your field of consciousness. It is a certain tool that is used. So it's important to understand that you don't want to destroy the ego. If you destroy the ego, you're not going to even be able to have the capacity to be self-aware. You'll be instinctual and driven by archetypes. You'll be animalistic. You'll be like an animal. It's the opposite of enlightenment. But you don't want to identify with the ego. See, there's a difference. You don't want to destroy it, but you don't want to identify with it either. You don't want to go, I am this. No, you aren't this. You can change it. You can alter it. You can transform it. So as we go along, keep this idea of the ego in mind. Now, I do want to say, though, that there is a kind of self-destruction that is required to achieve a higher state of awareness, at least hyper-awareness, which is the highest form of awareness. And we talk about this in Hyperianism a lot. It's one of the major goals of Hyperianism is to give humanity the tools to reach hyper-awareness. Now, the type of self-destruction that is required for hyper-awareness is called the metaphorical suicide. Now, remember, this is don't do anything dangerous, don't do anything illegal, don't harm yourself or others. This is metaphorical. So the metaphorical suicide is when you destroy your old self in order so that you can create your new self unimpeded by obstacles that would hinder your growth. So do you see the difference? It is not a destruction of your core sense of I, which if you demolished, you would no longer be conscious. The metaphorical suicide is about demolishing the aspects of you that were instilled by others, society, outside programming in general, that shaped and molded you into who you are today. It's about destroying all of that so that you can start over fresh and be a self-created individual based on a rational system that can create oneself and attain higher levels of awareness. So that kind of self-destruction is required, but not the destruction of the ego. Now, once again, you do not want to destroy the ego, but you don't want to identify with the ego either. The ego is a powerful tool. And if anything, one wants to expand the ego, increase the ego. And remember, ego doesn't mean being self-inflated. That's something else. You know, when someone goes, oh, that person has a big ego, that's just something that they use in colloquial terms. That does not apply. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the field of consciousness. You want to expand your field of consciousness. Now, we're going to talk about also developing an absolute ego and an analog all. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But to kind of pull this together, I want to take a look at this article on medium.com that says, should you commit ego death? So a common resolution to most human conflict is the minimization or eradication of the self in some form. By the way, before we continue, I just want to say real quick, there's also nothing wrong with temporarily bypassing the ego. So if you're having a psychedelic trip or you're in a meditative state, it can be powerful to temporarily bypass the ego to access some other state. But the goal is not to destroy the ego permanently or to deteriorate the ego. That is something that is done temporarily. We are basically just switching from a linear state to a more holistic state. Anyway, let's continue here. So a common resolution to most human conflict is the minimization or eradication of the self in some form. Now that should be very alarming right away. Why would the solution to many of today's problems be about minimizing or destroying the self? The red flag should go up right away. What life is about personal and collective actualization. It's about becoming more, becoming higher. Enlightenment is about going further, not going down, not going backwards, not regressing. It's about progressing. So, anxious? Remember, so these are examples being given. Are you anxious? Remember that you're not the center of the universe and that none of this really matters. Have you ever had that happen before? You go to someone, you go, oh man, I feel really anxious. And they're like, hey, well, remember, none of this matters. You're just a little speck on planet Earth. None of it even matters. You're nothing. This is such a toxic mindset to have, that you're not the center of the universe. None of this really matters. You are literally the center of creation, and that you are an eternal mind that is located in the frequency domain, the source domain, as is every single one of us. Without us, the universe would not exist. You are a critical, absolute, necessary, and eternal component to existence, who you and the rest of us are responsible for the existence of everything around you. And none of this really matters. All of this absolutely matters. It's the exact opposite of what is propagated today, and a big problem. The reason why this is so propagated is because of dogmatic materialist scientism. the empirical science of today that says reality is material and that you are nothing but a speck hurtling through nothingness with a nihilistic universe where everything is meaningless. This is untrue. This is false. And scientific materialism is become a great hindrance to the world. Now, science produces many technological advancements in medicine, and that's fantastic. That's fabulous. They are great pragmatically, but they are a disaster metaphysically and philosophically and ontologically. They result in a nihilistic world where people believe that nothing matters, and that and what do you think is going to happen? More depression is going to result from this, to be told that reality is meaningless and purposeless and that you are nothing at all but an aggregate of dirt destined to turn to dust and be food for the worms. So, continuing here, anxious, remember that you're not the center of the universe and that none of this really matters. Unsure of who you are? The self isn't constant, so why try to find something that's not there, right? Again, bullshit, right? The self isn't constant, that's correct. But why try to find something that's not there? No, create yourself. So you are constantly changing and transforming. Unsure of who you are? Don't just give up. Create yourself. Become who you are. That's why I always say, don't be who you are, become who you are. You are a work of art that is in constant progress, and you can become anything that you so will. So transform yourself into something powerful, something magnificent, something illuminating, something shining, something that will help transform yourself and transform the world. If every single one of us worked on ourselves and helped each other, we would have a self-reinforcing feedback loop of a world that is constantly becoming better because every single one of its members are making themselves and each other better. That's the kind of world that we want. That's the kind of world that we must have, that we should have, that we deserve. And again, every single one of these are absolutely backwards. Everything today that proposes to be enlightening is absolutely not, and will just keep you locked in a closet in the darkness. So, relationship issues, stop focusing on yourself and focus on your partner's needs. Again, there should be a give and take here. It should be a system where both of you, or if it's a poly system, multiple people, whatever the situation is, it's when you are, again, reinforcing each other. You are building each other up, where it's not one-sided, it's not lopsided, because that's what it is. You can have these relationships as sort of a microcosm of how it should be in a world where we are building and right now it's like we're in a toxic relationship. The world is in a toxic relationship with itself. It needs to get the fuck out and needs to find something better. And that thing better is, of course, Hyperionism, that self-reinforcing world that is constantly improving itself. And your needs are important, and there's this idea that goes around a lot in mysticism and enlightenment is, oh, service to others, service to others, service to others, never service to self. Service to self is bad. Always service to others, always. That's bullshit. Service to others is important, but service to self is also important as well. You need to be building yourself up and building others up, because the more that you are strong and secure and created, the better you will be able to help others. So this whole idea about being a doormat to be, service to others, service to, guess what? The rich elite love that. They're going to spread that around like fire. Oh yeah, service to others. Let us walk all over you. Yeah, so always. No, you need to be able to be a strong force yourself and help others as well. It's about self and others. It's about the individual and the collective, not one or the other. It's not only about the collective. It's not only about the individual. It's not only about the self. It's not only about the other. It's about self and other. It's about individual and collective. It's about one and many. So they say that this usually works. We remind ourselves a few times a day to stop acting selfish and to stop taking ourselves so seriously. Maybe we meditate or journal to really hone in on this idea of the transitory ego. Maybe we pull an Eckhart Tolle and sit on a bench for a year. But whether we like it or not, the internet bill has your name on it, and so too does all of your past mistakes. You can't plead not guilty simply because you feel like you don't feel like who you used to be. There is a self, however socially constructed, that dictates our behavior, choices, and overall experiences in life. Aside from escaping the mountains, ridding yourself of all material things and social connections, and sitting under a tree for the rest of your life, living without the self is pretty tricky in this day and age. And you see that a lot of people propose that as being something enlightened. escaping to the mountains, getting rid of all your material things and all your connections, and sitting under a tree and meditating for the rest of your life. Yeah, that's not going to do jack for you. All right. Life is about overcoming, transforming, and becoming better and being self-creating. It's not about withdrawing. It's not about disconnecting. It's not about refusing to engage. It's about facing challenges and overcoming those challenges. A trial by fire. That's what this life is about. It's reality is a lesson to be learned. It's a training ground. A planet is like a school that one goes to understand, learn, and grow. And so the idea is, yes, the self is often socially constructed, and now the ego and the self are not the same thing. So the ego is often socially constructed, yes, and that's why in Hyperionism we have the metaphorical suicide, which is to undo all of those external constructs so that you can be self-created rather than socially constructed, rather than constructed by outside influences like religion, parents, friends, family, peers, trends, all that sort of thing. You want to be self-created. So, but it's not about withdrawing and crumbling. It's about transforming yourself and giving yourself a fresh canvas to work with. So there's also a dark side. There is also a dark side of having no real sense of self or a lack of self-awareness. This is generally called a self disorder, where one experiences a minimal self. The minimal self described as a flame that enlightens its surroundings and thereby itself. It has no properties, no sense of narrative reflection or identity. Instead, the individual experiences a stream of consciousness. As Nicholas de Warren describes such a life, when looking at this tree in my backyard, my consciousness is directed towards the tree and not toward my own active perception. I am, however, aware of myself as perceiving this tree, yet this self-awareness or self-consciousness is not itself thematic. So the problem is that when this happens, is that you're losing yourself, your sense of identity, or sense of individuality, sense of being an I, sense of self-awareness. So the thing is that, you know what, if you're out in nature and you just want to experience the experience of it, and you don't want to burden yourself with thinking about it too much or whatnot, you just want to have an experience, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being in the moment when you want to have life experience, when you want to get away from complex thoughts and you just want to experience the wind on your face and feel the grass between your fingers and smell the flowers. You just want to have that experience. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But some people want to have this mindset all the time, and they want to sort of demolish any other way of thinking so that they're constantly in this mindset, and they think that this mindset is somehow a road to enlightenment. Now, this mindset is not a road to enlightenment. This mindset is a road to experience. It's a way to experience life, enjoy life, be in the moment. That's great. But it's not a way to enlightenment. Enlightenment is about reaching higher levels of consciousness, higher levels of abstraction, higher levels of meta thinking, metacognition, higher levels of concept networking that involve self-thinking thought thinking about itself. And if you read this, quote, when looking at this tree in my backyard, my consciousness is not directed towards the tree and not towards, my consciousness is directed towards the tree and not toward my own active perception. So that, and that's that shows a difference between humans and animals. An animal has a consciousness like that. When it sees a tree, it just sees the tree. It doesn't reflect on its perception of the tree. A human can do that. The dog just sees the tree. A human can see the tree and reflect on its own perception of the tree and know consciously, I am experiencing the tree. So that's awareness of awareness. So there's a difference here between sentience and consciousness. Consciousness entails self-awareness. So an animal is sentient. It is aware of the tree. A human being is self-aware, conscious. It is not only aware of the tree, it is aware that it is aware of the tree. And this is a higher level of abstraction, higher level of metacognition, and this is why it entails a higher level of consciousness. And it requires an ego to do this. Animals do not have an ego. Most animals. The vast majority of animals do not have an ego. That does not knocking animals are great. They can experience love and happiness, and they have an extremely rich internal life. They're awesome. but they don't have this ability of a constructed ego that allows one to engage in abstract metacognition. A dog can't think, you know what, I think next week I'm going to go dig up that bone that I buried 2 weeks ago, and afterwards I'll go have a bowl of kibble. It doesn't do that. It just follows its instincts. And you can see that when one destroys the ego and enters into these realms, you're entering these your modes of experience. You're entering modes of experience that are no longer entailing self-awareness, and they are becoming an animalistic, instinctual form of awareness. Now, the article goes on that this can worsen, especially in those who suffer from schizophrenia. And this is true because the ego is also something that helps order one's consciousness. The patient may experience disconnected and interfering thoughts, auditory hallucinations, and inability to grasp time. The self is absent, and so too is the stable core we use to navigate our reality. And the ego is a stable core. It's sort of this organizing function as well. It organizes your field of consciousness. It organizes it and structures it into something that can be comprehended. So there is also an ego death, the complete loss of subjective self-identity. This is generally brought about through the use of strong psychedelic drugs and spiritual activities. This is perhaps best defined by Carter Phillips as the renunciation, rejection, and ultimately death of the need to hold on to a separate self-centered experience. And so what's actually happening right now is in Hyperionism, this isn't so much, what this is the development of the absolute ego, or the analog all. And what the difference is here is that, and this is now getting into transcending to higher levels of consciousness, because when you go from animalistic consciousness to self-awareness, you have developed the ego. Now, when you start transcending to an even higher level of consciousness than just self-awareness, you're going to develop an analog all and an absolute ego. And what this is a sense of self as the entirety of the universe and being connected to all things. So this is a connection to everything and all things, and realizing that you aren't just a disparate individual, that you can transcend the viewpoint or the perspective of being an individual that is separate, and you can go into the perspective that we call the absolute perspective in Hyperionism, that is you as the entirety of all things, everything being connected together in one holistic system. So this does not necessarily need one to destroy, renounce, or reject, or kill the ego. It is about a perspective shift. It is about temporarily bypassing the egoic perspective and entering into the perspective of the absolute, of being all reality. And psychedelics are very powerful for this. I'm a big proponent of psychedelics. Remember, don't do anything dangerous or illegal. But the point is there doesn't have to be this hatred or renunciation or rejection of the ego. It is about switching perspectives. It's about, it's about like going from the first person view to the top down view. It's about, having, it's just a different viewpoint, because this reality is one and many simultaneously. And it is a unity that can experience itself as a multiplicity. So some suggest that the experience is similar to kissing death itself, and that coming close to death actually allows one to accept their mortal limitations, thereby transcending the need to prop up the significance of the self. It can also create existential angst as one begins to see the illusion behind the I. Now, what the illusion is that your ego is something that is persistent, because your ego is a construct. You aren't the ego. You don't want to identify with the ego. It's not who you are. What you truly are is an eternal monadic mind. So they're using the self and ego interchangeably here, but they're different. And in Hyperionism, we mark that difference by calling the self the higher self. In Jungian terms, Jung just uses self. But in Hyperionism, we say higher self just to make clear that we're talking about something distinct from the ego. So what you truly are the higher self. You is an eternal monadic mind. That is persistent. Now, your ego is a tool that your higher self uses in order to interact in the world and learn and come to consciousness. And ultimately, it will come to self-awareness as it develops higher and higher forms of understanding. But again, one does not want to identify with the ego. One wants to know that they are more than the ego, but to be able to use it as a tool. So Nick Brommel suggests that ego death reveals to us the potential for radical pluralism, the idea that we could really choose whatever and there's no fundamental difference in meaning. Or as William James proposes, the world pieces are held together by nothing more than conjunction. It's just one damn thing and another. This, in a sense, reveals the limitations of living without the self. Can we go on living with such a lucid awareness of our own meaninglessness? That's the problem that this world faces. One of the many problems that this world faces is that it has succumbed to nihilism, as Nietzsche knew that it would. It sees life as meaningless and purposeless. And guess what? We have the world is absolutely rife with problems like, anxiety, depression, all these sorts of things. And a lot of it stems from this, because what it does is that life truly is meaningful. And the meaning of life comes with connection to the self and connection to others. That is the meaning of life is entailed in that, because we are a one in the many coming to know ourselves through our own self and collective actualization. So you can trace back almost all problems to be a fundamental disconnection from the self or disconnection from others. And the meaning of life is entailed within forming these connections and strengthening these connections and coming to know these connections, because that's what reality is. It's a one in a many that's coming to know itself, through its own interactions within itself. It would be quite challenging to justify our existence if we could honestly tell ourselves that none of this matters. Love, justice, faith, hope, it likely doesn't matter. But that is authored by a perspective absent of the self. A perspective that us humans simply cannot exist with for any longer than an afternoon of peyote. The self is the framework through which we find meaning. It is the core that permits us to navigate the dizzying world we were born into. Now, I will say this article is slightly confusing because they're using self and ego interchangeably, where they are not. They are different things. Of course, disorders such as narcissism point us towards the risk of relying solely on the self as a framework. The self-involved tend to make their own idea of reality to heart, and soon they find themselves creating their own, much to the dismay of those around them. So yes, a healthy journey towards minimizing the ego should be entertained at the very least, and if the traveler feels well equipped. No, so this is false. A journey towards minimizing the ego should not be entertained. One should maximize the ego, but in doing so also develop the analog all, and realizing that we are not just ourselves, but we are all things together from the absolute perspective as the collective. Because if you do that, then there are no issues that will, all issues will melt away. Because you're not going to do something that impedes another irrationally if you know that ultimately you and that other person are just aspects of one system, that in essence you are me and I am you. From that absolute perspective, it takes away that idea of doing something in an irrational way that will stop you from actualizing. So no, minimizing the ego is not something that one should do. One should maximize the ego. Your ego is the center of your field of consciousness. And as you continue to create and transform yourself, you're creating a brilliant work of art that's completely changeable and malleable. You can make that as into whatever you want. It's like a character in a story that you are free to write, free to create. But it's important that you don't identify with that. It's not who you are. Just like you don't want to identify with your body. Your body is a tool. It's a vehicle for you to interact with. And you can decorate it, you can transform it, you can do many different things with your body. But it's not you. You don't want to identify with it. You want to know that it is an aspect or a tool of you. And so recognize that we experience the world in an incredibly limited sense. The stormy waters of the temporal, of the metaphysical and ethical are deep and treacherous. Without a worthy vessel, will drown quickly. So make sure you maintain your vessel. Treat it with dignity, tend to its needs, discover its strengths and weaknesses, and only take educated risks, but never allow it to override the significance of the journey itself. That's why you're here anyways, right? So this is a very interesting article, and they get some things right, some things wrong. I mean, they are critical of the idea of destroying the ego, but they also do not come to the correct conclusions. But it highlights the problem that is being perpetuated by this nihilistic society today. And some of the worst offenders are, New Age systems, mystic religions, Eastern religions that tell you that you should destroy the ego, or that the ego is somehow the enemy. It is not. It is a powerful tool, and it is a healthy tool. It is the center of your field of consciousness. And ultimately, you will be developing higher tools to achieve higher levels of consciousness as well. If you destroy the ego, you will go backwards. You will downgrade. You will regress, not progress. And the scientific materialism of today also is a huge culprit in perpetuating the nihilistic view that this world currently has, that life is meaningless, it's purposeless, that you're nothing but a speck on a planet within a void spiraling into non-existence. None of that is true. You are you are the center of the universe. You are the creator of the universe. You are an intrinsic part of reality, as we all are. We are the creators. We are the destroyers of all things. And we can transform this world according to our own will, and we can transform the entirety of the universe itself to our will. So it's about time that we leave behind. You see, this world is completely backwards. It's an insane asylum. You can almost guarantee that whatever this world is perpetuating, the opposite is true. We do not live in a nihilistic world. We live in a world of purpose and meaning that entails connection to ourselves and connection to others. We do not live in a materialist reality. We live in a reality of eternal mathematical mind that is self-transforming. And destroying the ego is not the path to enlightenment. It is the path to regression back to an instinctual self. One does not want to identify with the ego, but one wants to use the ego as the powerful tool that it is, making sure that one does so properly and in the right ways, and then one can reach higher modes of existence as one develops the analog all and reaches a new perspective, the absolute perspective, in realizing that we are all reality, in addition to being a subjective viewpoint in an individual nodal experience as well. We are having that individual experience as a disparate human in multiplicity with others, but we are also, from the absolute perspective, all connected together in one holistic system. So I hope you enjoyed this video, my friends. I have a lot of videos on this. Check out the different ones in my channel. If you are new here, please hit like and subscribe. It helps out a lot. Make sure you do it. And if you enjoy my work, consider supporting on Patreon. Helps out a lot. You get access to our weekly secret live streams, our hidden Discord server, The Citadel. And I want to give a big shout out to our supporters, especially Renaissance Fairy, Trent, Cassidy, Michael, Evie, Alan, Angela, Maria, Brian, Chubby Bunny, High Expectations Counseling, Jordy, Nicole, David, and Yilsavet, and everyone else. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And the link will pop up right over here if you want to support.